So without more ado, John, we're delighted to have you with us. Over to you.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, friends and colleagues. So nice to see you all from CMSC and to see Ida. It's so nice to see you guys. Thank you again. You were all here in Accra last year, February, when we had the inauguration, and we're still hanging in there with all the challenges of the pandemic, and we are doing the best we are able. So thank you for your prayers and for your support. And thank you for this opportunity to partner to do these seminars, especially as it is focused on Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa in particular. We very much appreciate this partnership, and we hope that this will be the beginning of more things that we can do together between our two institutions. So what I'll be doing today is to share with you a paper that I published a few years ago on what is titled "The Patterns of Christian-Muslim Relations in Sub-Saharan Africa." John Chesworth will be familiar with this paper, I think, if he remembers anything at all I said in the paper. But otherwise, and I'm sure some of you would have seen the paper also. So I thought it would be good to open this seminar series with that paper for reflections and for us to discuss some of the new trends in the patterns of Christian-Muslims encounters in Sub-Saharan Africa. And I'm hoping that we will have quite a number of our African friends join in so they can also share. So I'm not good at reading papers, but I will try to read it and then make, as Martin said, make time for us to have questions and answers. So I will share my screen and read the paper so that you can all follow, hopefully, because it will help with following them when I'm just reading on my own. Since the accents, we have different accents here, it will be helpful if I did that. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen as I read the paper. That is, if I can find it. Okay. Maybe I need to pull it up first. Then go back there and share the screen. I can't seem to find the paper to pull it up and share the screen. Okay, I've got it. Can we see it now? Good. So I just want to preface this by saying that what I'm going to do is to talk about the encounters between Muslims and Christians in Africa in pre-colonial times briefly, and talk about the encounters during the colonial times. And then the third phase is talk about the encounters in independent or post-colonial times, so that we can look at it in that kind of historical order. So this is kind of painting a historical picture of the Christian-Muslim relations or encounters in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa in particular. But some of you, I know you are very familiar with the works of Jane McAuliffe, who has done some fantastic work on Christians, on the Quranic Christians and Christianity in the Quran. The Quran is replete with references to Christians and Christianity in various ways, but the Bible is not the same. We don't find references to Muslims and Islam in the Bible for obvious reasons, because Islam came 700 years or so after Christianity, after the Bible was already in place. So that is the situation that we have. And many people think that what the Bible says, what the Quran says, or what scripture says is what people of belief or believers tend to follow and to abide by and to adhere to. The Bible says these people are this, you treat these people this way, you do that. The Quran says treat these people this way, we do that. We don't find that in sub-Saharan Africa. And we will see that as we go ahead to look at the encounters in sub-Saharan Africa. So Christianity was well established in Africa, in Egypt, North Africa, the Sudan, and Ethiopia at the time Islam emerged in the 7th century. We have Coptic Monophysite Christianity was well entrenched and flourishing in Egypt and Ethiopia by the 7th century. According to Muslim tradition, in 615, the Prophet of Islam, in the face of severe persecution, advised over 80 male converts and their families to seek asylum in Christian Abyssinia on account of his belief that Abyssinia is a friendly country. During this very first meeting between Christians and Muslims on African soil, one of the female refugees who later became the wife of the Prophet of Islam is reported to have said, when we reached Abyssinia, the Nagus gave us a kind, that's the king, gave us a kind reception. We safely practiced our religion and we worshiped God and suffered no wrong in word or deed. We suffered no wrong in word or deed. So Muslim tradition would have us believe that this meeting was more than just a warm African Christian hospitality accorded to refugees, but rather a meeting of minds. So Islamic tradition recount that at the king's request, Jafar, the leader of the delegation, recited a passage from the Quran, Surah Al-Maryam, chapter 19. And upon hearing it, the king, according to the Islamic tradition, the Nagus wept until his beard was wet. And the bishops wept until their scrolls were wet. Then the Nagus said, of a truth, this and what Jesus brought have come from the same niche. In other words, the Muslims were not just wonderful people, and the Christians were not just wonderful people who received them, but their beliefs kind of coincided, kind of aligned. And therefore, the Nagus did not see reason why not to accept the Muslim refugees. Some Islamic sources claim that the Nagus himself later converted to Islam, while other accounts indicate that some of the refugees converted to Christianity and even went on to ridicule their former co-religionists that we now see clearly, but you are still blinking. So who converted who is not very clear in the traditions, but there are claims on either side that the Nagus converted, but there's no history, there's no historical data to that effect, because that would have been very obvious in the history of the Ethiopian kingdom. While the veracity of either of these claims may be hard to ascertain, what is not in question is a number of curious similarities between the beliefs and practices of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church and those of Islam. For example, the word Tawahido is a Ge'ez term denoting the unity or oneness of the human and divine natures of Christ, as opposed to the two natures of Christ belief that was held by the Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, and mainline Protestant Christianity. We know the Christological controversies of the time. Tawhid is the Arabic Islamic equivalent. So we have the Tawahido and we have Tawhid. It's the Islamic equivalent which denotes the unity or oneness of God in Islam. Other distinctive similarities between the Ethiopian Orthodox Church and Islam include the following: fasting, belief in angels, an official language for worship, Ge'ez for Orthodox Church and Arabic for Islam. For Islam, scriptures are chanted or recited during liturgical worship. Followers traditionally follow dietary rules, specifically with regard to how an animal is slaughtered, while pork is prohibited. Women are prohibited from entering the church or mosque during menses and are expected to cover their hair while in worship. The sexes are segregated during worship, which includes prostration. Worshippers remove their shoes when entering the place of worship. These are features that are shared between Islamic worship and the Ethiopian Orthodox, or mainly Eastern Orthodox Christianity to a very large extent. So it's curious just to observe these similarities and this early encounter. All the above point to the fact that while it may be difficult to draw firm conclusions about the direct influence of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church on nascent Islam, there is no doubt that the type of Christianity that Islam interacted with most profoundly in the early phase of its encounters in the Mediterranean and in Africa is Eastern Christianity of late antiquity. William Mill has speculated that if an Arab asylum had not at last offered itself in Medina, the Prophet might happily himself have emigrated to Abyssinia. So Abyssinia was the first hijrah, if you like, except that the Prophet himself did not migrate. As a direct result of the hospitality and protection accorded to the early Muslim refugees, and no doubt the high regard in which Abyssinians were held by early Muslims, Abyssinia was granted a special status in classical Islamic jurisprudence, belonging to neither the realm of Islam, Dar al-Islam, nor the realm of war, Dar al-Arab. Abyssinia was assigned its own category, the realm of neutrality, or Dar al-Hiyab. The realm of neutrality, which means you cannot declare war on Abyssinia based on Islamic teaching at the time, because Islamic jurisprudence did not recognize Ethiopia as a legitimate target of jihad. The Abyssinian model of Christians receiving and hosting Muslims as their guests provide us with some insights. In this first encounter, Muslims lived as honored minorities within an African, albeit Christian, political system. This host-guest encounter or pattern was to be replicated in successive centuries in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, especially in the West and Central Sudan region, with Muslims living under the patronage of traditional African rulers. Indeed, in some cases, the relationship and exchanges were deeper than that of a host-guest encounter. In Gonja land of northern Ghana, for instance, officiating Muslim clerics reminded traditional rulers during enskinment ceremonies that the Malam, or the Muslim teacher, were to the chief as his wives. In other words, the Malams who officiated the enskinment of the chief will remind the chiefs, we, the Malams, are your wives. Don't forget that. Now, this proverbial statement had a double-edged meaning. First, it confirmed the favored position accorded to Muslim clerics within the traditional system. Malams should be provided for and protected by the chiefs as he would his own wives. The second meaning is a reminder to the Muslim that he is a wife and not a son who should rival the chief for his office. This principle was applied throughout most of tropical Africa in different ways. And as the English adage has it, behind every successful man, there is a woman. So it can be said that behind every successful traditional ruler in Africa, there was a Muslim cleric. Now we can say that this is not a term that is a very gender-sensitive term to use nowadays, a saying rather. But this was a very creative arrangement that kept the offices of the cleric and the chief apart, but not divorced. Lamin Sanneh discusses these arrangements, highlighting what he calls the tradition of enclavement, within which accords guarantee protection to strangers and non-kin groups on the one hand, and on the other, the inclusive and tenacious nature of local religions. While these early encounters outside Abyssinia were not strictly speaking between Muslims and Christians, but rather between Muslims and traditional African societies, it is important to bear it in mind. Christian and Muslim Africa is for the most part enfolded within the larger setting of old Africa, with its deep-rooted hospitality, tolerance, and generosity. And it would be surprising if nothing of that admirable heritage did not survive in the new religions. Both sides are involved in a creative transformation process, and it cannot be stressed enough how much Christian and Muslim Africans owe to traditional Africa, whatever the rhetoric of religious propaganda may say. And it has to be said that this is not an idealistic view of traditional Africa that Sanneh expects, or at least hopes, will have beneficent effects in the realm of Christian-Muslim relations, or a romantic yearning for an idealized Africa, but a view shared by celebrated Muslim thinkers like Ahmadu Hampâté Bâ, a Malian Muslim scholar who lived in the last century. Hampâté Bâ writes appreciatively of Islam's interaction with traditional Bambara and Fulani religions, and celebrates the fact that Islam took hold and grew in sub-Saharan Africa upon the foundations of traditional religions. In other words, traditional religions have formed the bedrock of Islam and Christianity in Africa. And that still is the case today, irrespective of what our doctrines, our dogmatic positions are on both Muslim and Christians are. Many Christian Africans and Muslim Africans still continue to dabble into traditional religious practices, and even to carry quite a bit of it into their Islamic and Christian practices. I will skip this part and go to the next part. So you find that there was this host-guest relationship that formed the first kind of pattern of encounters. The Muslims coming in and Africans who were not Muslims receiving them as their hosts and playing host to them. And Muslims were granted this kind of status throughout sub-Saharan Africa for a long time, especially, as I said, in sub-Saharan Africa. So this was the first encounter. It was the host-guest encounter. The second encounter was rather in a more militant and confrontational encounter, which started with the wave of Islam spreading into North Africa. So the second major encounter between Muslims and Christians on African soil was during the first wave of Muslim conquest of Egypt in 640. Coptic Christians in Egypt, like their Nestorian and Jacobite counterparts in Palestine and Syria, welcomed the invading Muslim armies. At the time, these Christian groups were declared heretics and suffered discrimination and persecution at the hands of Christian Byzantium. Coptic Christians therefore saw the invading Muslim armies as liberators and welcomed the new rulers with thankful hearts. A 13th century Coptic historian offers the following interpretation for the Muslim conquest of Egypt. This was the period during which the Byzantine emperor oppressed the Orthodox people and required them to conform to his creed, which was contrary to the truth. From these two men, the Christians suffered great persecution, But in their time, the Hanifite Arab nation appeared and humbled the Romans and slew many of them and took possession of the whole of the land of Egypt. Thus, the Jacobite Christians were freed from the tyranny of the Romans. Jacobite Christians, or Coptic Christians for that matter, felt that the Arab invasion freed them from Byzantine Christian persecution and oppression because of the different doctrinal positions that the different Christian communities took at the time. So the first Muslims came to Africa seeking refuge. The second group came as invaders, yet both were welcomed with open arms. Copts, like their Nestorian and Jacobite counterparts elsewhere in the region, allied themselves with the new rulers who granted them freedom of worship in exchange for the payment of jizya. So the first entrance of Islam into the continent of Africa was met with welcome, open hands. Africans opened their hands both in North Africa and in the Horn of Africa to receive Muslims when they first showed up on the continent. The relationship periodically, however, came under pressure, with sporadic persecution against Christians arising mainly from popular anti-Christian sentiments whipped up by individual Muslim preachers or harsh policies by individual rulers, and continued struggles with Christian Byzantium. With Christian Byzantium. Indeed, apparently things didn't always work out in practice as set out in treaties. And John of Nicaea, who lived towards the end of the 7th century, records the following mixed feelings of the Copts towards the Muslim conquest. John records that the Muslim invader, Amr, the Muslim general who led the conquest of Egypt, had no mercy on the Egyptians and did not observe the covenant they had made with him, for he was of a barbaric race. And Amr became stronger every day in every field of his activity. And when he seized the city of Alexandria, he had the canal drained in accordance with the instructions given him by the apostate Theodore. And he increased the taxes to the extent of 22 batter of gold, till all the people hid themselves owing to the greatness of the tribulation and could not find the wherewithal to pay. So in other words, the conquest was not just hunky-dory. There were challenges, especially the imposition of exorbitant taxes on the Christian population in the name of jizya. So from the mid-13th century onwards, Christians in Egypt, like their counterparts in the rest of the Middle East, came under sustained and severe persecution, provoked partly by the Crusade from the West and partly by the Mongol invasion from the East. During those difficult times, Christians were viewed as a fifth column and collaborators with foreign invaders, constantly accused of various calamities and treated as terrorists. Severe and systematic persecution of Christians started in Egypt from the beginning of the 14th century as an official policy. Muslim rulers in Egypt extended the standard Islamic treatment of Christians to the old Christian kingdom of Nubia. In the treaty known as the Bact, Nubia was allowed to retain its sovereignty in return for allowing free passage and settlement for Muslim traders and payment of an annual tribute in the form of 360 slaves to the Muslim overlords in Egypt. This arrangement lasted for centuries, during which period Muslim merchants themselves, itinerant teachers and migrant groups swelled and gradually changed the demographics of the weakened Nubian Christian state, which was eventually overwhelmed by the might of Mamluk Egypt and overrun in 1275. Nubian Christianity, which was the state religion and a royal cult, intimately associated with foreigners, and Greek culture was already weakened because it lost contact with the Coptic Church in Egypt, its source of leadership and inspiration. Sudanese Christianity therefore eventually disappeared with the fall of the political structure it hitherto depended upon. Islam continued its march as an ideological, political, and military force. Abyssinia's special status had outlived its usefulness, with sporadic attempts made to take it militarily. In the early 16th century, emissaries were sent from Mecca to preach jihad against the Christian kingdom, leading to the launch of a full-scale jihad in 1529 by Ahmed bin Ibrahim, called by his Abyssinian adversaries as Ahmed Gran, the left-handed. In the process, he destroyed a great number of churches and monasteries, and it required help from the Portuguese to defeat him in 1543. As John Wall points out, these Ethiopian wars are the only wars between formerly Christian and formerly Islamic states from the early Muslim conquest until the era of modern European imperialism. Muslim wars of conquest continued through the 17th and 19th centuries, replacing all African kingdoms and chiefdoms with Islamic states and caliphates, empires and caliphates, the most celebrated of which is the Sokoto Caliphate, initiated by Othman Danfodio in the 19th century. These events had an impact on relationships, leaving in their wake a legacy of suspicion, fear, and even outright hostility to Islam amongst tribes who would become Christian in later period. In Ethiopia, for instance, by the late 17th century, a royal decree of religious discrimination forced Muslims in Abyssinia to live in segregated ghettos in order to contain what was called the Muslim threat. Subsequent emperors continued with this policy, and more or less right up to the modern period. And even harsher edict was issued in 1879, requiring all Muslims in Ethiopia to convert to Christianity or be killed. It was not until 1994 that the Constitution of Ethiopia granted equal status to all citizens, including Muslims, and to all forms of religious expressions. So you see the way that Christians tended to react to some of these militant Islamic invasions. It is worth pointing out that during the medieval and modern eras, the Christianity that was encountered by Islam in Egypt, Nubia, and Ethiopia was an imperial and an imperialistic tradition. Success on the military and political front was regarded as a sign of divine favor, and setbacks were viewed as divine retribution. In other words, Christianity was far from being a pacifist tradition at the time. Both traditions were locked in ideological and military struggles, in which Christendom won in Ethiopia, while Islamdom won in Egypt, North Africa, and Nubia. So encounters during the colonial period. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to venture south of the Sahara in significant numbers in the 15th century. These were sailors and soldiers accompanied by missionaries. Portuguese encounters with Islam in Africa during this period were mainly on the East African coast. Here they established a stronghold called the Fort Jesus in Mombasa, engaged in a series of armed struggles with the Ottoman Empire for control of the sea routes, and by their subsequent alliances with Abyssinia, were successful in defeating Ahmad Gran in 1543. The Portuguese fell out of favor with Abyssinians as a result of an aggressive policy of converting and rebaptizing Orthodox Christians into Catholicism, led by the Society of Jesus, or the Jesuits, and Latinizing the Orthodox Church. An unholy alliance between Muslims and Ethiopian Christians led to the defeat of the Portuguese. So here the tables are turned. Now Muslims and Christians joined together to defeat the Portuguese. For Jesus fell to to Muslims in 1698, and the Portuguese were forced to abandon their mission work on the east coast of Africa. On the west coast, a Portuguese traveler who visited the Senegambia region in 1456 and 1458 gives the following account of his discussion with the Muslim cleric in the court of a traditional ruler. He said this: a certain bishop of their church was there, a native of Mali, who asked me about the God of the Christians, and I answered him according to the intelligence God had given me. I finally questioned him respecting Muhammad, in whom they believe. What I said pleased his lordship, that's the king, so much that he ordered the bishop, that's the Muslim cleric, within 3 days to leave his kingdom. So this Portuguese is claiming to have won the debate and caused the chief to expel the Muslim cleric from his kingdom. European Christian involvement in Africa was curtailed following the Portuguese debacle on the East Coast. This coincided with a period of great internal turmoil within Christendom as a result of the fallout from the Protestant Reformation movement, which began in 1517. The bloody and devastating Catholic-Protestant wars that raged in Europe from that time meant that for nearly 3 centuries, European Christians had little time for foreign adventures. The desire for outreach overseas was to resurface in the Protestant missionary movement and European colonial expansionism in the 19th century. Muslim-Christian encounters in Africa from the 15th to the late 19th century were almost entirely the encounters between European Christians and African Muslims. In these encounters, the two sides were pitted against one another as rivals, competitors vying mainly for commercial and political dominance and as a byproduct for converts. European colonial encounters with African Muslims had more to do with political and economic dominance than religious considerations, at least on the part of the colonialists. The basic policy of the colonialists was to avoid offending Muslim religious sensibilities while suppressing possible agents of fanaticism and rebellion. In many areas, the colonialists debarred Christian missionaries from operating in Muslim areas and actually actively promoted Islam. So for colonial policymakers in Africa, Islam was considered best suited to the less sophisticated mind of the African, not just as a preparation for Christianity, but a religion in its own right. In other words, for European colonial officials and scholars at the time, Africans were to be left alone because Islam suited them. Christianity was deemed too sophisticated for Africans. And for that, on the basis of that, policies were formulated to debar missionaries from working in Muslim areas, but also because of the political considerations that the colonialists had in their interests. So Muslim responses to European colonial and imperialism were mixed. There were those who opposed it militarily on the military front, and yet there were those who also welcomed Muslims were not univocal in their response to the colonial rule. So we know the names of some of the Muslims who rose up, who arose in arms against colonial rule. But then we also know of Muslims who wrote in support of colonial rule. So for instance, we have this from the Habe, which is the Hausa group. We Habe wanted them to come. It was the Fulani who did not like it. When the Europeans came, the Habe saw that if you worked for them, they paid you for it. They didn't say like the Fulani, commoner, give me this, commoner, bring me that. Yes, the Habe wanted them, that's the Europeans. They saw no harm in them. So these were the Hausa converts to Islam who said they welcomed the Europeans with open hand, the British for that matter. And on the Francophone front also, we got a similar letter back in the 19th century, the early 20th century, which was written by French Muslims in Ivory Coast. And the letter is said is addressed from Muslims of Korogo to the people of Mecca, written during the First World War. And it reads in part, whoever does not wish to see the French in our country is also held in contempt by us Muslims, since our prosperity depends entirely on the arrival of these latter in our colonies. The French stopped the ravages of the Samori Touré slave raids, and so Muslims were appreciative and welcomed them also. But for the missionaries, it was a different ballgame altogether. The missionaries took a dogmatic kind of confrontation with Islam. They made it their duty to undermine Islamic religious system and sought to prove to the Muslim by argument and controversy that Christianity was superior to Islam. So during the 19th century, there were debates, these polemical, and John Chesworth knows quite a bit about this, since most of his students have written on this in East Africa, what is called the mihadras, the debates, public debates. And you find this still going on in some parts of Africa today. So missionaries adopted that kind of theological debate posture with Islam. And the missionaries pushed back. The missionaries pushed back on the idea that Islam suited the African. The missionaries objected to that and pushed back on that also, because they said Islam had no good for Africa. And that was their position. That also provoked a response from some leading African scholars at the time, like Edward Blyden, a leading African clergyman who was caught in a debate. Edward E. Blyden, a celebrated 19th century African-American Presbyterian missionary who worked in Sierra Leone, in response to the missionary demonization of Islam, he said it was prejudice, it was even racist in his mind. And he argued that Islam had so much good for Africa, and that Islam was not just a religion, a foreign religion in Africa to dominate and oppress and to make the African feel inferior, unlike Christianity in Western hands. So Edward Blyden argued passionately for Islam being a liberating force in Africa and not just a religion that kind of suited them in that sense. And also it was in the same way that you had someone like Samuel Ajayi Crowther, a Yoruba CMS missionary who emerged, and he adopted a completely different approach also to Islam. He started off with this encounter in school where he saw a Muslim child wearing an amulet, and he tore the amulet off and sent the boy home. And then the boy's father comes to protest, and he challenges the Muslim community to a debate. And according to the records, Ajayi Crowther himself felt disappointed after the debate. He said that, I'm looking for the quote that he gave here. He himself said that when he went for the debate, he went prepared, and whatever he said, the Muslims simply said, God has no son. The Muslims kept repeating that, and he was frustrated by that. And so he felt that it didn't work. So Crowther developed a completely different strategy of using of scripture, and especially the Yoruba Bible, in translation to engage with Muslims. And he felt that that was more productive, because Crowther talks about how his use of the Yoruba Bible and prayer from the vernacular version of the prayer book impressed the Muslim ruler the most. When he had a discussion with the Muslim ruler in Ilorin, he impressed the Muslim ruler by using Yoruba translation of the Bible and the common book of prayer. In independent Africa, as we know, the relations have been very, very different also. Islam, I don't have time to read through all of this, so I'm just going to give the highlights. Islam actually prospered during colonial times. The Muslim population increased from 34.5 million in 1900 in the whole of Africa to 145 million in 1960 in sub-Saharan Africa. So the Muslim population actually quadrupled during colonial period. And whereas Christianity's explosive growth in Africa took place after independence. It took place after independence. And so the encounters between Christians and Muslims in independent Africa very much mirrored the historical pattern outlined above. And it was impacted by the colonial past. The Christians and Muslims were separated by colonial policies, and yet all of a sudden, during independent time, jobs and independent nation policies of transferring people from different parts of the country to another and opening up the country meant that Christians and Muslims were getting into more intimate spaces together during independent times than they did during colonial times. And so you find that there is what we call the dialogue of life, which began to take place. Muslims and Christians attended each other's religious ceremonies, attending schools together, boarding schools, spending years in boarding schools together. And these encounters fostered some kind of built relationships also. And yet, at the same time, we also find that there have been tensions in Africa, especially when it comes to the rise of Islamic militancy and also Christian Pentecostal charismatic preaching that are very aggressive and polemical towards Muslims and Islam. But one of the important also factors that have contributed to Christian-Muslim relations in Africa is the weakening of the state institutions. Where we've had corrupt, failed states, we've had problems between Muslims and Christians. And most of these, I have given examples in the paper, ranging from Sudan to even Nigeria in the early phase of independence to Central African Republic, where we've had collapse of the state, and that led to brutal Christian-Muslims conflicts. And also, so the state is crucial for peace and harmony, interreligious peace and harmony. But the other factor also is, of course, foreign interventions and foreign contribution. Muslims continue to look over to the east. Christians continue to look over to the west. And so in Africa, one of our challenges is the importation of not just goods, but ideas and knowledge, which itself is not bad at all. But I feel like many African Muslims and Christians feel that they even have to import their salvation from the East and from the West. So theologically and hermeneutically, we still look up to the West and the East. And therefore, whatever happens there, it has repercussions here on the ground. So looking up to the West and looking up to the East is one contributory factor to Christian-Muslims encounters in Africa. Having said that, I would want to say that if African traditional religions continue to hold sway as it does, many Africans still always fall back to that as the last resort. And if they fall back to that, they fall back to their family, they fall back to the tradition, the kin group, they fall back to the fact that this is blood is thicker than water. And therefore, at the end of the day, the positive voices and those who want to engage, you find examples that I've also given in the paper, ranging from Central African Republic to Nigeria. Even in the face of violence, Muslims and Christian imams and scholars reaching out to work together for reconciliation and for peace. And these forces, in my view, are going to win the day. But I have said that for me, the state and the health of state institutions in Africa is critical. And Christians and Muslims, instead of fighting and competing with each other for our own interests as communities, for the tradition that we subscribe to, we should work together to strengthen the state institutions, because that is where we have the hope of sustaining Muslim-Christian relations in a very positive and a healthy trajectory than we have now. So I will pause here. As you can see, I've skipped through the second part of the paper, and I will pause here for us to have some time for conversations. Thank you.